Hello and welcome back to Current Conditions. I'm your host, Maggie Hittman. Today we will be talking again about place, but instead of place from the perspective of terrapsychology, which is largely focused on the psychological impacts of place, we'll be talking about place from the Ayurvedic perspective. So we'll be getting into more the physical impacts of different environments and locations and how some of those physical aspects of place actually can inform terrapsychology and how someone feels in a place, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, etc. But we have to begin with the physical components of place. So Ayurveda actually posits that health cannot be had without a healthy relationship to one's habitat. And that's in part because we are considered to be almost ingesting the qualities of the places that we live in the same way that we're ingesting food and nutrients. And part of that does come, at least historically, from the fact that most people were eating the food that was grown in a place, so that the food was going to have the qualities of that soil and the air and all of that. But there are also qualities of a place that are coming from just contact with the elements, not just necessarily the food itself. So this is considered an extremely important part of health, having a good relationship with your place. And that also does include the seasons. So the way that the qualities of a place are cycling through the seasons and our ability to adapt to those changes is in Ayurveda considered a cornerstone of health. So it all kind of starts with the fact that Ayurveda is based largely on, I know the doshas are more well known and familiar to people, but the gunas or the qualities of things are a huge part of Ayurveda, and this is how individuals are assessed and how different medicines and foods are assessed and how their interaction with an individual will be understood. So the gunas are different qualities that are actually paired so that there's, and these are the Gaurvadi gunas that I'm talking about. So this is 20 gunas, 10 pairs of opposites. And they're used in treatment to balance each other, basically. So if there's a lot of for example, coldness in someone's constitution or in a disease condition that someone is suffering, then warmth will be used to bring that back into balance. If there's a lot of dryness, then lubrication is, or snigdha, oiliness, oily kind of quality will be used to bring that into balance. If there's a lot of lightness in the constitution, then actually heaviness in some form or fashion, whether that's physical, like a weighted blanket, or heavier foods or activities, all of that is used medicinally to bring someone back to a state that is closer to their innate prakriti, or the balance of kind of elements and the gunas from birth, because that's going to be the state of being that is most conducive to health for the individual. So in our environments also, there are these qualities constantly. Some of them are stable, more stable, like in a desert, it is dry. In a swamp, it is wet. And then some of them are more cycling through the season. So even in a desert, there are wetter periods where the gunas in the environment are going to be changing seasonally. So it's actually really important to have a good understanding of the seasons in your location for this reason, so that you can employ the different qualities that will counteract their potential negative effects. And if this is not done properly, then the doshas can get thrown off, the constitution can get thrown off, the digestion will then get thrown off, and that's kind of the beginning of the disease process. And as that gets further along and remains unchecked, so if the exposure continues to those qualities that are amplifying a condition, then it will be more and more difficult to bring that back in line, and eventually you can get a kind of irreversible condition that you can only ameliorate the symptoms. So I think it's an important topic because we are so mobile, and I think we are still feeling a little bit immune to the conditions on the ground in a real way. Like, we don't understand necessarily, at least in the West, how influential drastic changes in temperature and climate, flying around the world, all of these things have on what's going on in our body, particularly if those things are happening with some frequency. There is also the idea in Ayurveda that you are kind of habituated to the environment and the place that you grew up. And so any change in location can be kind of a big deal for health, especially if that location is drastically, even mildly different than the one that you grew up in. That really needs to be taken into account, and lifestyle and food habits and all that will need to be modified to accommodate those changes. And there's even an idea that the place where your ancestors came from is, on some level, there's a concept called satmya, which is in Ayurveda, which is saying that things that contributed to health or were wholesome that you did as a younger person, like in your upbringing, or even as an older person, but with over some duration, these are really good things for you. So they will have a more profound impact on your health than things that might even be considered wholesome, but they're brand new to your body and you don't have experience with them. So things that translates back to your childhood and your upbringing, whatever you were eating there, especially if it was some kind of locally grown, vegetable or food that was cooked in some traditional manner. But that can even sort of extend back to the people who influenced your DNA, for example, because that's kind of in you also. So that includes, and this is maybe not explicitly stated in Ayurvedic texts, but it's, I would say, consistent with the ideas of Ayurveda. The environments of your ancestors, one could hypothesize, would be similarly conducive to health because they'll have the gunas, or the qualities in the environment that were familiar for you potentially for many generations of your ancestral history. And then also the foods of your ancestors. There is something there about consuming something that is so familiar on a really deep, kind of unconscious level to your body. It's a little bit of a sidetrack, but I think very interesting, especially, again, considering the mobility of our current culture and the probably lack of adaptation in the midst of that mobility. If we were to really travel well, we'd really want to eat the local foods of a place, kind of like as soon as we get there, and really focus on that in order to acclimate to the environment and manage the qualities that are predominant in that place. Okay, so in order to get a little bit deeper into this idea of place from a physical Ayurvedic perspective, I'd like to talk about the places that were outlined in the classical texts, the different groupings of environments, and also the seasonal factor. So this is desha. Desha means place, and kala, which is time. So the cycling of time within that place. And these are two critical factors to assess in order to maintain health. So the three main environments in the Ayurvedic texts, which these were fomented in India. So the main thing is that we understand from this how important it is to assess our own environments and what main characteristics are being used. But there are probably other categories of environments that are relevant for other places. So this is just giving you an idea of what the main kind of framework is here historically. So we have jungle Adesha, which is dry desert type environments, and I'll go into the qualities of that. And then we have Anupadesha, which is the more swampy, kind of wet environments. And then we have Sadharana Desha, and this is more moderate, basically kind of in between the other two. This of the three is the one that is much less likely to produce disease because it's not extreme. So it's actually more conducive to health. It's sort of, I think of it as a Mediterranean climate, actually. And I'll bring up some maps here of the US and disease prevalence through different parts of the country. And you'll see that the doshas associated with each of these places, because they'll each, except for Sadharana, which is least likely to provoke any dosha, the other two have a proclivity to provoke the doshas. So you can actually see how that kind of maps out in a place. So Jangalaresha characteristics, this is from classical references, Charaka, Shashruta, and Bhava Prakash, in case anyone's wanting to go dredge up the text. The sky is level with the ground, wide open plains. Trees are very sparse, few and thorny. Rain, springs, and wells usually have less water, so it's a very dry place. Mountains are sparse and low. Physical bodies of most people are usually firm and thin. So I think this is where it gets really interesting, is you see the qualities of the environment that people are living in actually translating directly into their physical bodies and stature through, like I said, these guna. They are manifesting these gunas in their physicality. So it's very blatant in that way. Diseases of Vata and Pitta are common. So the desert type places are considered aggravating for both Vata and Pitta constitutions. And for those of you who are not familiar with the doshas, the Vata dosha is dry and light and airy and mobile. It has these qualities, and Pitta dosha is more heated and a little bit volatile. And so the qualities of the environment, the desert being dry and hot, not always hot, but has definitely the capability of being hot, those characteristics are provoking to people who naturally have those qualities in their constitution. Okay, they each have these descriptions of how trees are kind of operating along with the wind. So continuous dry winds cause the tender branches of trees to dance and sway. Abundant in thin, dry, rough sand and gravel, creating mirages inhabited by specific kind of birds. Physical bodies of most people are usually stable and hard. Many animals like antelope, deer, bucks, donkeys. Many pleasantly sweet fruits. A natural disposition to aggravated vata, often encouraging vata disorders. So that's probably the number one thing that people living in these environments need to manage is the vata, the dryness. Especially, it will depend on how dry the environment is. But if it's very extreme, then pretty much every aspect of your diet and your lifestyle and any kind of herbal regimen is going to need to focus on bringing in qualities that will counteract that dryness. So that's where you see things like abhyanga or body oiling will be really useful in a desert environment, and definitely having more fat in the food. Those are, you can't get away, and I live in a desert, and so I know this, but you can't get away with just skimping on any of that for very long. You will notice the dryness comes in very fast, especially in places that are extremely dry or at high altitude. And the same, it's going to be the same situation in other environments that are extreme in any way, that they're just more difficult places to live in maintaining health because you have to be pretty strict about balancing whatever quality is extreme in the environment. So then we have the Anupadesha, which is the damp external environments. So with the desert environments, if we're talking about the US, I have, that's going to be like the southwestern states, Arizona, Utah, New Mexico. These are the places where these qualities in the environment are quite obvious. Parts of California as well. And then Anupadesha, I would probably map this onto possibly parts of the Midwest and the South in the United States. And then when we get into Siddharanadesha, California is that kind of Mediterranean climate. And of course, there will be other parts in the world that have that sort of climate too. So Anupadesha, abundant water, the ground is depressed, low, sunken, and raised. Many rivers and abundant rainfall create dense, thick, and impenetrable forests, thickets, and woods. Soft, mild, and cool breeze, many mountains and big trees. Physical bodies of most people are usually soft, tender, and well developed. And so this is that's showing more kapha in the constitution. So kapha is the dosha that it tends to be sturdier, is stable, has weight to it, and resilience. It just tends to also be physically a little bit larger. And the qualities of an Anupadesha are very consistent with the qualities of kapha dosha. So people will tend to have more kapha in their constitution in these places. Diseases of kapha and vata are common. So there are some qualities of this place that can also aggravate vata. Cold is a quality or guna that is aggravating to vata. So sometimes when you have a damp external environment, like if you think of even maybe like Oregon, a place like that where it's really wet and cloudy, then that cold characteristic is going to potentially be aggravating to both actually kapha and vata. Deep forests of trees, including specific types of trees here, these would be relevant for India. Generally located along rivers near the sea, often has a heavy, cool, refreshing breeze. Nearby rivers are adorned with beautiful plants, mountains covered with beautiful creepers. Gentle breezes blow through thick, swaying trees. Many varieties of beautiful flowering trees and thick forests, with trees having thick spreading branches, sounds of birds. People are gentle and of tender build. There is a softness, there can be a softness to kapha dosha, which I think is being reflected here. Animals like rabbits, boars, elephants, deers, and duck in these places. And then we get into Siddharanadesha. So these are the moderate external environments, not too extreme, not too dry, not too wet, probably not too cold, not too hot. Features and characteristics of both environments. Cold, rain, heat, and wind are generally moderate. Doshas are generally in a state of equilibrium. So these are actually, if you want to be really healthy, these are places where it's a lot easier to have health. You don't have to basically battle your environment, the extremes of your environment. Creepers, trees having fruits without flowers, trees having fruits and flowers, birds and animals as described in the other two environments. People from this environment are generally sturdy, tender, strong, have good complexion, proper bodily structure. Okay, so those are the three main environments. You can probably guess what your environment is of these three based on the descriptions here. And then what you want to figure out is how that environment and the qualities of the environment might be interacting with your personal constitution, your stage of life, any existing health problems that you have, which usually the health problems are going to have one or more doshas that are predominant. And so if, for example, you have arthritis or some sort of vata condition or osteoporosis, and you're in a vata place, like a desert environment, it's actually going to be more difficult to manage your condition in that environment. So you can actually use this strategically and consider either moving to support your health or really adapting the home you live in and your kind of immediate surroundings or where you spend the most time to have kind of like counterbalance to those qualities in the environment. Like a humidifier would be a good example in a very dry environment to reduce some of the vata, at least in the living situation, the immediate living situation. So within those places, then there will be the season cycling, which are going to continually modify those qualities and bring them kind of to different sorts of crescendos, where there will be like a peak of the dryness or a peak of the wetness and other qualities coming in at different seasons. Sometimes there's a windy season or a very rainy sort of monsoon season. And so within this larger somewhat stable influence of the place itself, there will be these little modifications happening continually that you also will need to be aware of and be modifying your diet and routine accordingly. So it's a bit of an art to adapt actually to your environment if you're really paying attention. It's once I think you get off the bandwagon of just kind of eating whatever you want, and like watermelon in the winter and, really heavy meats in the summer and things like that, like the cultural diet, and actually start paying attention to how food impacts you and what actually makes sense in different places and different seasons. Like when I first moved to the desert, I tried to get away with a fairly light diet, like mostly vegetarian diet, and the place just will not have that. The qualities in the environment simply will not allow that. So if I wanted to eat like that, I would need to probably go back to kind of like coastal California, where the environment is moderate enough that you can you have more wiggle room to make choices and do what you want. Similarly, in a wetter environment, although culturally, I think the diet, especially in the US, the southern US, is heavier. That is a symptom of from the Ayurvedic perspective, a symptom of the imbalance in that, the kapha imbalance, the kapha dosha, basically in that place. Because ideally, in a hot, heavy, wet environment, actually the food would be very light. You would want the food to be fairly light, not as many heavy meats and oils and certainly the deep fried food would not be ideal. And when we look at the maps of the US, you'll see kind of the disease rates, especially in the southern US, are, I think, some of the highest in the nation, like overall. And then definitely when we look at specific kapha type diseases. And so some of this, I think, does connect to terrapsychology. I think it's kind of how some of the principles of understanding the influence of place translate directly into health. But a lot of these assessments of the environment, they actually are part of the terrapsychological framework, assessing the local ecology and flora and fauna and weather patterns. All that is part of the Terrapsych framework. This, I think, is just getting really specific about how it impacts physical health. And of course, how you're feeling physically is going to impact also how you're feeling mentally and emotionally. And I think it's pretty apparent that the overall kind of personality of a desert environment versus a swampy environment and the influences of those places are going to be pretty different. So this is related, and also we're going down just a little bit of a different kind of rabbit hole here to get more specific about the physical aspects and influence of place. And I think if we talk about the place itself as a personality, which I do like to talk about it that way in terrapsychology, then the seasons are sort of the changing mood of that place. And your mood, of course, is changing along with that seasonally, and that will be slightly different in different places. And there is some discussion in the text as well about potential large-scale disruptions to places and how that also influences the health, not just of individuals, but of entire communities. And that comes through a disturbance of air, water, land, and season. Those are kind of actually in increasing order of importance. So the disruption to air, for example, in the case of air pollution, is obviously not ideal for anyone's health. When it happens to a community, everyone can potentially be affected. Similar for water, that's going to be something that at least historically everyone was going to be imbibing and relying on. So if there's an issue there, and that doesn't always mean just like polluted water, but the Ayurveda goes into different types of water, each having their own influence. And there's kind of these like sort of rancid types of water that you don't really want to be drinking. So that would be the next level of collective disturbance if it gets into the water. And then when the land is getting disrupted, then that's going to influence the viability of the crops. And there's also discussion about the potency of the medicine grown on that land. And in the case of epidemics, they talk about harvesting the herbs and the medicines well before, in advance of the epidemic. So before the land itself is beginning to deteriorate and is not able to actually produce what it once may have. So that's, and these are also in increasing order of kind of like what takes the longest to be repaired. So air pollution can be cleared fairly quickly if the issues are removed, and then water would be next in line in terms of remediation. And then once the land itself is getting disturbed, that can be quite a process for repairing the soil, as many people know now. And then when the seasons themselves, so this is all very applicable to now, obviously. The land, we are already in that situation where the land is, the things produced on the land, they're not having as high of a mineral content. The nutrition in general is just kind of declining across the board. So it's actually harder to get what you need, eating even the same quantity of food that maybe our ancestors would have eaten. And then when the seasons are getting disturbed, that's basically climate change. And then everything becomes less predictable, and it's harder for, even on land that's already compromised, to then be trying to grow plants in weather that's not likely to support those same plants anymore. You know, there's a lot of potential problems there. And that again is going to be something that's very difficult to correct. It's not like clearing the source of air pollution where within a day or two you're back to kind of normal, healthy air. This is trying to return the seasons to their normal positions is a huge project, and one that is not straightforward. So this was mentioned in the classical text, and the causes for this disturbance of seasons, and the cause is basically continuous, persistent, collective moral transgressions from the Ayurvedic perspective. So it's especially when the people in positions of power are going against morality and dharma and all of that, then eventually, if that continues over a period of time, then that's considered to be the factor that causes this environmental degradation and disruption. And it's said that the best thing that you can do is basically Ayurvedic treatment, and that would be panchakarma and following Ayurvedic lifestyle, harvesting herbs before potential epidemics arrive, and prayer and goodness and what they call righteousness and being connected to your spiritual life. And all of those things are in the classical text considered some of the best protection for these times. So that's just a side note. Where I would like to go next is into the maps that I mentioned. Okay, so osteoporosis is considered primarily a Vata type disease. So it would be exacerbated by Vata gunas, or the qualities of Vata, which are light and dry and mobile. And these are the qualities that are also in many desert environments. There's also with Vata, some of the main gunas are subtle, clear as well. And these are qualities that you really do see in the desert environment, that with the large vistas and the really clear air, which, like, spiritually speaking, can be very profound, I think, and the whole lightness of all of that. But these gunas, along with also the rough guna that Vata has, they're going to be exacerbated. So if someone's having a Vata disease, living in a Vata environment, then it's basically in the same way that when you're dealing with diet and lifestyle, in the context of a disease, there are certain things that the person cannot get better if they do not eliminate these major provoking factors from their diet or lifestyle. So sometimes that's going to be like people who do night shifts, and they have some kind of, also usually that's a Vata aggravating thing, and they're working against themselves by keeping that routine. And so you'll see that when they change their lifestyle or change their occupation, so that huge factor, which is impacting their health and working against them, it's working for the disease and against their health. Once that's eliminated, then a lot of progress can be made. It's sort of the same with the environmental factor, particularly if it's extreme. So you can see here that the highest rates of osteoporosis, these are projected, but based on current data, some of the highest incidents are in these really dry states. The Nevada and Arizona have the highest rates of osteoporosis. So those are very Vata places. They are definitely in the jungle Adesha category. And I know there are other factors here too, with all things health related, but this is fairly dramatic example. And if we go to obesity, which is very likely to have a kapha component. And again, the kapha dosha is sharing a lot of qualities with those wet anupadesha types of environments. You can see that this obesity is sort of centered in these states that have those more moist, dense, sort of humid environments, which are going to aggravate kapha. Some of the gunas of kapha are the heavy, slow, oily, dense, static, cloudy. So these are some of the things that you'll see in the kind of swampy, definitely humid environments. So I know, like I said, that there are many factors that go into these health statistics, but I think it's a pattern to pay attention to. And then here we have another disease that is usually associated with kapha dosha, and you can see how it's again concentrated in these kapha type places in the southern US. And notably Texas is in the south, but it's also a little bit more of a desert sort of climate. So these are just some examples. You can look for yourself and kind of play around. There are a lot of different maps out there which can help us at least start to identify patterns like these. And by the way, those same maps, they are excellent tools if you are attempting to undertake a little psychological investigation of your own place. Those it's informative to know in what way people are suffering in a specific place in their bodies. That is not unconnected to some of the principles of terrapsychology that say that we're really heavily influenced by basically all factors in our environment. So I think that's useful information. And then other maps also showing different climactic factors, different ecological factors, and how that's spread out over different places. Those can be really good ways to visualize the different impacts in your place. And then when you have a little bit of an understanding of Ayurveda and the different qualities, at play and how they might be interacting with your specific constitution, then you can get a real sense for basically how contact is being made between you and your environment. And it's not limited to just physical contact. It really does have an impact on your mood and your thinking, the thoughts that you're thinking, all of that. I think an example that I kind of go back to, I did go through that. I talked a little bit about my research with Utah and the Great Salt Lake. And knowing what I know now about Ayurveda, there's actually a specific way that there's different ways the doshas can change. They can be increased or they can be decreased in an individual. And knowing what I know now about the state of my body and my constitution, when I moved to Utah, and the fact that I was moving basically from Anupadesha into jungle Adesha. So very wet, Midwestern, humid, kind of stable climate into an extremely dry, light, rough, movable climate, which was exhilarating on a certain level. I think that's where the Terrapsychology comes in. Like, it's really driven by these micro qualities, I think. So making contact with that, actually, I think it dried me out in a beneficial way initially, because I was just so saturated with the Midwest. But then at a certain point, it became so dry that it created other problems, because I didn't know I thought I could translate my lifestyle in the Midwest into the desert, and that was not tenable in any way. So I can look back and see how there were different things happening in specific ways in the doshas that basically got me into a state of vata kshaya, which is actually a decrease in vata, which can look like kapha. There are other things going on here too, so it's not actually that simple. But some of the suffocation feeling I eventually came to be under in Utah, I think could be like kind of clinically diagnosed in Ayurveda as a vata kshaya state, which is where you're sort of frozen and stuck, and the normal mobility and movement is impaired, and that can look like even injuries that come in and stop someone from their normal day-to-day movements and tasks and hobbies and things like that. But also internally, it can be this sensation of stuckness that I think I mentioned when I talked about Utah, which is that Great Basin really is an interesting place because of the exacerbated vata in the environment, and then also the potential for it to get really trapped and stuck in the inversion phenomenon. The trapped air is a real thing. So it's fairly nuanced, but I think you can do that with every place. I think you can kind of like blend a little bit or start to translate Ayurvedic principles into terrapsychological understandings, or break down terrapsychological insights according to Ayurvedic principles. I think there's a lot to be done there. So hopefully this inspires you to take a deeper look at your place from this angle and evaluate in whatever way is interesting to you the qualities of your environment, and trying to understand how that influences you. I think it's very interesting to take a look back at major moves you've made and how you felt in different places. And then also if there were any physical issues that started, shortly after you moved to a place, or maybe even improvement in physical symptoms after moving to a place. I think that's all really important stuff to pay attention to. And of course, there will be the piece here about, bringing in the astrology chart and each sign being associated with different environments. So to kind of thicken the plot. For example, Scorpio is associated with desert environments. And for each person, and for myself included, Scorpio has a specific importance astrologically in my chart. So it was not just the move and the qualities in that desert environment. It was also the fact that there are planets there bringing their karmic impact which is activated in that place. So when you move to a specific environment that's associated with a sign, you activate that part of your chart. So that's a third layer here outside of the Terrapsychology and the Ayurveda. So it's very, in my mind anyway, very interesting, very intriguing. Hopefully it is to you too. And yeah, thanks for listening. See you next time.